right? Okay. Exam 2 is Thursday. The end of the study guide for exam 2 is at the end of the exam of the study guide, it talks about renewable and non-renewable energy, mostly about non-renewable energy. That is the topic of today's lecture. Whatever we don't get to today that is on the study guide will not be on the exam. Okay, only the material we get through today is what you'll be responsible for and what you'll be tested on. Okay, we'll pick up with non-renewable and renewable energy after spring break, and feeds directly into our air pollution lectures and conversation about climate change, which is what the focus is of our last unit of class. Okay, so if we don't get to it, but it's on the study guide, you're not responsible for it. You're only responsible for what we actually talk about. Okay. Caleb.
I know this is super early, but can you talk about wave energy at all?
I usually don't, although I do mention it when we talk about hydroelectric energy. Definitely is something that is on the horizon, and it's so readily available. There's such a wide area in which to generate wave renewable energy that it's really attractive. With lots of the things that we've been talking about, it needs another boost to be scaled up to actually producing electricity for communities. Right, exactly. Like it needs that boost to prove its feasibility on a large scale. Just like when we talked about modern agriculture and some of these kind of green buildings and ideas about urbanization, like we just need more trials, we need a little bit more money to prove that these concepts actually do work. And that's definitely true of like wave and tidal energy in particular.
Yeah, because my idea was that wave energy can produce just as much, just as efficient
Oh, yeah.
as coal.
Definitely. And that's something that as we start to talk about these energy resources, we're going to start with the non-renewables because they feed into this idea of non-renewable mineral resources, things that we've been pulling out of the ground, and they're part of the mining process. A big factor of what we're mining from the earth are fossil fuels for these non-renewable energy resources. And so we've looked at the problems of getting them out of the ground. Now we need to look at the problems of their use. And what I want you to realize in this discussion is that the energy production in terms of energy efficiency for renewable resources is much, much higher than for fossil fuels. And so switching may be expensive at the beginning, but it saves us a ton of money in the long run. And in lots of cases, it will produce for us more electricity per unit of energy put into the system. We'll get more energy out at the end. And so it makes a ton of sense to switch. It's just the manner of switching. Like we talked about with solid waste, like we've talked about with urbanization, like we've talked about with mineral resources. Once you have the information, I believe, in your hands, you're willing to make the choices that make you a better, a wiser, more responsible consumer. You have to start making this type of shifts on a societal level if we're going to impact big changes. Okay, another factor to remember is that service learning reflection is due today for those of you who participated in the first activity. That's today. And then our second service learning 2, will be next Saturday. Okay, it's March 23rd. It's the second Saturday of spring break, and we're going to be at the Cincinnati Nature Center Long Branch Farm, and we're going to be doing invasive species removal. And so if you want to sign up for that activity, you can do so here. You're welcome again to bring non-UC people with you. Everybody takes and does a release form. There's a little thing, what to expect, what to bring when you come. And I'll talk about it really briefly on Thursday before we start our exam again, but just a reminder if you want to come. If you've already done one, you don't have to come to the second one. If you've done the first one and you would like to come to the second one, you are welcome to do so.
Okay, do another one to report.
No, you only have to do one reflection. You don't have to do a report on the second one.
So if we utterly fail first reflection, we can do it again.
Exactly, Andrew. With the talk. I don't anticipate that. Okay, last Thursday we had finished talking about recycling, and I want to add just a little bit more to the conversation to remind you guys why recycling is important. Definitely we see that there are energy and resource savings that come when we use recyclable products. This particular infographic says that, hey, if you recycle 1 can, you save enough energy to run a TV for 2 hours. 1 glass bottle recycling can power a computer for 30 minutes in the energy savings. Recycling 500 phone books saves 7,000 gallons of water. And when we recycle a ton of steel, we essentially save ourselves 1,400 pounds of coal. Again, energy that's necessary to process these particular ores straight out of the ground. And so we can save a lot of energy and mineral resources when we recycle. There are problems with recycling though. There are tons of advantages in recycling, and definitely the energy efficiency, the savings in landfill space are really important. But there are some significant disadvantages to recycling too, and then we'll talk about those in just a couple slides. Again, in terms of what we want to think about in the future of recycling, we definitely want to start to cut down on the amount of paper waste that goes into our municipal trash stream. A large chunk of what we throw away is paper. A large chunk of what we recycle is paper. And that's particularly important because that's a living, renewable resource. And recycling paper saves a ton in terms of that renewable resource that we're taking out of the ecosystem. So it saves in habitat destruction. The other thing it does is it helps us when it comes to climate change. Leaving trees growing helps them store carbon and start to sequester it in the soil for us. If we're harvesting those trees, we're short-circuiting that sequestration of carbon dioxide, and we're kind of keeping it up here in the atmosphere, even though we're not adding anything new to what's here. We're not helping ourselves to actually suck it out of the atmosphere, which trees do for us naturally. Okay, so 55% of our timber harvest is for paper. That's about 100 million trees each year here in the United States. Recycling paper then uses less natural trees. It uses less water, it uses less energy in the production of that wood pulp. So it really helps us in terms of ecosystem degradation and energy efficiency. Glass is something too that we recognized in our own looking at our recycling habits here in the classroom. Glass and metal are not products that we recycle a lot today, even though they were what started the recycling movement to a large extent along with newspaper. And so that's a shift in what our products are packaged in. We don't have a lot of glass. The other thing to keep in mind though is that because there's less glass and metal going into the recycling stream, that means that it's less profitable for recyclers. And so we have to somehow transform this system into one that still makes recycling profitable, and that's becoming harder and harder for a variety of reasons. As we shift the different types of plastics and packaging that we're producing in our waste stream, as we shift who is collecting this recycling and actually processing it, that's very problematic for the future of recycling. One thing that tends to help with glass recycling is to offer refunds if you bring back your items and get them either refilled or you actually return them to the place that you bought them from. You might pay 5 cents more per bottle that you buy in a 6-pack of glass Coke bottles, but then if you return those 6 bottles to that same store, they'll give you your money back. And Ohio is not a state that generally participates in this, but states like Michigan and Pennsylvania are. All right, the other big thing, of course, in terms of recycling is to somehow get more of our plastic waste away from single-use disposable plastic waste into the recycling stream. A very small percentage of plastic is actually recycled in the United States. There's a ton of confusion about the recycling of plastics. It varies place to place what numbers are accepted, whether or not it's put in caps, whether or not it has to be just a jug with a neck on it, and it has to be a narrow neck. Like there are rules about recycling, and that leads to less recycling when there are more restrictions. So it takes a bit of education. And those communities that do a big education campaign about recycling and waste disposal are the ones that have good consumer buy-in. They have good stakeholder buy-in. They improve their recycling rates. They then can have a marketable, clean product that they can sell into the recycling market. Okay, all right. So the advantages of recycling, most importantly, it reduces solid waste that goes into landfills and incinerators. It reduces energy and mineral use. It reduces pollution that's produced from that energy and mineral resource use. It helps with pollution, of course, of the solid waste trash in and of itself. And it helps with air pollution in the smelting and production of these different ores, the incineration of solid waste trash as it moves to the environment. One of these big factors that comes with this pollution is a reduction of greenhouse gases. These materials are not going into the landfills where they can be degraded into methane. They are not going into incinerators where they turn into carbon dioxide. By recycling them, we save all of the fossil fuels that go into the generation of that first use product. So there are big savings and advantages when it comes to recycling. It is a critical structure of our waste stream, and it needs to be an increased portion of our waste stream. But again, the big focus should be on refusing and reducing the waste that we produce in the first place. And something that I want to remind you guys of is that we can do a ton with our municipal solid waste. But the municipal solid waste that we generate here in the United States is a tiny fraction compared to what mining and industry and agriculture produce. If we really want to cut down on the amount of solid waste that we produce, those large businesses that are making the tons of solid waste have to participate in these types of recycling ventures. They have to be reducing and refusing to produce their waste too. So we can do a ton, and we can show with our behaviors how important these changes are to us. And then when you go to your workplace, it is time to tell the businesses that you work for that, hey, we're actually having a bigger impact as a business, as a company, as a corporation. Let's participate in these types of solid waste practices. Okay, there are some disadvantages when it comes to recycling. It, just like solid waste disposal itself, it can be hazardous when it's done improperly. There are a variety of chemical and mechanical means, physical means that are used to recycle these different compounds that we send through the recycling. They all involve toxins and hazards in order to break down chemical bonds, reform chemical bonds, pelletize different materials, break up starting materials. That needs to be done in a safe and a controlled environment. And when it's done here in the United States, in the developed world, that there are regulations in place around workplace safety and worker compensation that protect workers from these types of instances. But when recycling is done overseas in many cases, those environmental and worker regulations are not in place. And so when we send our recycling away to be dealt with by another country, we're pushing the burden of the potential hazards of that recycling process, whether environmental or to workers, onto the people in that location who may not have the same protections. And we definitely see that has been a problem in China and Southeast Asia, that communities that are taking in our recycling are doing it the fastest, cheapest way that they possibly can, and that very often exposes them to different toxins in the actual recycled materials, particularly we talk about electronic waste and batteries. And then the environmental costs and consequences pile up in their communities too. Okay, it is more expensive than what we see if we're going to just landfill our trash, and that moves some communities away from it. It does help us in reducing landfill and incinerator, kind of what's going into that waste stream, which means those companies that are managing landfills and incinerators, they don't like recycling because it takes away profits of the amount of stuff that's coming into their waste stream that they can get discharged from. It can be inconvenient and confusing for people to recycle, especially when it kind of comes to composting, which is the next phase of recycling. What goes in composting? What can you use? How do you do it safely in a non-odorous fashion? And then the lack of processing facilities, the movement of our recycling overseas, and China just recently saying that they aren't going to accept our recycling, means that we have a pileup of recyclables, and that we don't have a good manufacturing stream in order to transform those recyclables into something that's valuable, which means that there's no market for it, and communities are going to have less advantage, less incentive in order to push recycling with their own communities and consumers. And so, yes, recycling again is an answer. It is part of the answer, but we have to do it better. We have to do it more responsibly. We have to do it more wisely. We maybe have to put more money into it to get it where it needs to be. Dominic.
So with that problem, does that mean all recycling is going to go into the landfill?
Yes. Yes. Right now, most people who are in the recycling business are in it both to make money and handle waste streams, and because they honestly care about the environment. Like they see this as a solution and they desire to be part of the solution. And so my understanding is that most recycling facilities in the U.S. that have nowhere to send their recycling and they don't process on site themselves and something that can go into manufacturing are stockpiling this on their locations. And just now they're like peaking in terms of how much they can store on their property. And so they need to send stuff to the landfill. landfill, or they need to ship it off to someone who's gonna process it, or they need to buy more land to store recyclables until those manufacturing processing facilities come online. And that's, that's a very tenuous position for them. How much longer can they afford to store this without making it profitable for themselves? Again, for lots of these business owners, they're in it because of environmental reasons, so they're going to do that. But eventually they'll have, they're going to have a real problem. And yes, it will end up happening. So, when you leave class today, you're going to start a recycling processing plant. Okay. My kid saw this picture and he was like, "What is that little girl doing?" And I'm like, "She's extracting rare earth metals from lead acid batteries." He's like, "Why isn't she in school?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's a great question, Harlow." Okay. Recognize what happens to your waste when you throw it away and the consequences of what happens when we don't deal with our responsibility. Okay, this means that we need something like an industrial ecosystem where the waste from one business becomes the resources that feed into the next manufacturing process. Again, this idea that recyclables go right back into the production stream, and that businesses and companies talk to each other about what mineral resources they need and where they can get them rather than mining them out of the earth. How do we create a self-sustaining system when it comes to our mineral resources? Both in recognition of how much limited quantity of a particular resource we have on the Earth's surface, but also in recognition of the waste that we're producing, either in the production process or in the actual waste end of life of a product. And so there are several of these types of community industrial ecosystems that have turned out to work pretty well in Europe, where different companies put out and say, at the end of my manufacturing process, I have this amount of chemical left over, and another company goes, "Hey, I need that chemical to manufacture my particular product. I will buy it from you. And it's cheaper to buy it from you because it has already been used, and it might not be as pure, but that does not matter for my process, and so it's actually financially profitable for me to buy this reused or recycled product." So that takes communication between companies. And when they do that, though, we can find solutions to those mineral resources as well as solid waste production. Yeah.
How many companies don't have recycling?
I don't know the offhand answer to that. My gut is a lot. Like for instance, when I was in graduate school, so, within the last 10 years, in this century, the building facility where I was doing my PhD did not recycle. And so we get tons of packages each day into each lab, all in cardboard containers, right? And that was just going directly into the trash. And one of the gals in my lab was like, "This seems crazy. Like, why can't we recycle this stuff?" And it was just a simple fact of like, oh, somebody has to call somebody, and we have to set up for a recycling company to come and actually take away our recyclables, and what can we put in recyclables, and which one of us on staff will be responsible for collecting the recyclables. And she was like, "Well, I'll help do that. Tell me who to call." And so she got our building to do that, to start participating in recycling. It took a couple months to set up, and then all of a sudden we were starting to fill up this huge bin of recyclables, and our trash production just went almost to nothing in comparison to what we were recycling at the building. And so I think it takes that kind of recognition that, hey, we can do this, and like, what is inhibiting us as a corporation from doing this? How can we overcome that roadblock?
Listen, it's hard to be a grasp because I guess at least around here, where I'm from, every trash company that we have is also a recycling company.
Right.
And they have their own recycling equipment.
When I used to work with the high school sorority for quite a number of years, and when we have our annual meeting, like, we generate a ton of paper waste. Like, we just make paper waste. And so it was always a big deal for me to be like, okay, this is our box where we're throwing our used pieces of paper, and the hotel that we're meeting in will pick it up and recycle it. And when we went to Alabama one year for our conference, their hotel did not recycle, and like, I just about had a heart attack. Like, I almost couldn't work for like 10 minutes because I was like, we generate like trash can worth of paper each day, and they're just gonna throw it in the trash. But it's completely recyclable. Why are they collecting it? This is a large hotel. Why don't they have recycling bins? What is the problem? Like, I couldn't comprehend it. And I went and asked the hotel, like, oh, do you have a place where we can put our recyclables? And they're like, no, we don't recycle. And she's like, it's like getting that powerful cup. She's like, what is this? What planet am I on? And it's a value shift. It's a recognition that this is possible. You know, like the hotel is like, you know, we have no company in town that recycles. Where would we send our recycling if we closed? Okay. Somebody sell them? Yeah, morning.
I just find it incredibly ironic how your PhD for like environmental stuff did that other thing to set
I know.
separately.
I think that was, I mean, the gal that I was in that, you know, kind of kicked the building manager in the butt to get him to start the recycling program definitely felt the same way that, you know, we're out in the environment doing environmental studies work, and then we come back and we are generating recyclables in our work process, and yet we're not recycling them, you know. And of a volume that we couldn't take it home with us and do it, you know, at our apartment complex. At our apartment complex being like, why do you have 15 cardboard boxes that you're bringing home with you? Like, I swear I'm not done. It is ironic, and it is those kinds of ironies that if you stop for a second and recognize, then you can be willing to fix them. But it takes a bit of a The other thing that I wanted to mention before we get into energy consumption today is this idea of the precautionary principle. And it's something that we're seeing more and more environmental science policies are recognizing the need for this. And that currently in today's business marketplace, processing pre-consumer production of items, we're going to be generating chemicals and compounds and waste or products that we don't know potentially if they are toxic or not as they're used, as they're produced, as they're wasted. And our current principle here in the United States is that we're going to use it and assume that it's safe until it is proven harmful. And this has gotten us in a lot of trouble in that we produce compounds or chemicals, and then we find out 10 or 15 years later that, hey, this causes cancer, and it's been in all of our homes. Okay, this is asbestos, this is PCP, and this is DDT. Where we've been using compounds and then finding out later that they are problematic for us or our environment. And the precautionary principle says, like, wait, let's do the exact opposite of that. Let's prove that products and compounds are safe before we start widespread distribution. Let's do the regulatory burden and research before we spread these products and compounds throughout our bodies and the environment. And that's what the precautionary principle says, that when evidence to the contrary is lacking, that we want to take measures to reduce harm in the beginning. We want to assume that products are potentially unsafe until we prove them safe, rather than assuming that they're safe until we prove them harmful. Okay. And the precautionary principle is generally utilized a lot in medicine, right? Like, we have to prove that these drugs are safe for us and don't have unwanted side effects before we're going to put them into widespread distribution. We want to apply that same type of principle to other types of products that we utilize, with the understanding that what we put in our environment eventually ends up affecting and impacting human health. Okay, so we want to assume things are harmful until we prove it otherwise, rather than assuming that they're safe until we prove them harmful. This means that we may have to remove certain chemicals and products, technology, from our marketplace until they are proven safe to utilize in a widespread fashion, or until we can say this is the appropriate use pattern for this particular object. You know, hey, little kids shouldn't be exposed to this. You know, certain types of organisms should not be exposed to this, which means that you may only be able to use this in particular types of environments or in particular types of well-controlled settings. Let's see what the next thing. This means that the burden of proof is now on the manufacturers and scientists associated with the production of these compounds or products to prove that they are safe, rather than on scientists and regulators to prove that something is toxic. The precautionary principle makes a ton of sense, and it should help us avoid 50 years down the road suddenly coming upon something and being like, oh my God. Our widespread use of that for the last 50 years has caused the ozone hole to actually get worse instead of better. Okay, the precautionary principle is designed to help us prevent problems before that actually happen, rather than having to deal with the consequences of a problem that we've been unintentionally producing for the last however many years it takes to actually accumulate a problem. And this is, to me, the precautionary principle is a common sense approach to environmental science, to environmental health, to human health. The idea that we want to make sure something is safe before we deploy it, rather than waiting to figure out later that it's toxic and then stopping its use and trying to contain the harm. There are real advantages, I think, when it comes to environmental health and human health to using the precautionary principle. But there's a lot of pushback on the precautionary principle because it means that it may take longer to get products onto market. It may inhibit certain products from ever being on the market because they are proven to be toxic or untenable from ecosystems or people. Okay, so the precautionary principle is designed to prevent chemical hazards. We're going to take the time to actually perform the toxicology experiments so that we don't release toxic chemicals into the environment and along the life cycle of a product. And it's designed to prevent these types of ethical mistakes where, oh my gosh, this compound that we've been exposing ourselves to actually turns out to cause genetic mutations or cancer in certain groups of individuals. Okay, again, it's the idea of asbestos was put into homes and products, including clothing, in order to be a fire retardant to help protect people. But it turns out that even short-term exposure to asbestos can cause cancer and respiratory ailments. Yeah.
Isn't that like an FDA thing?
Yes, but the FDA right now functions on the back end. They say that, okay, you're putting a product on the market. We now want to make sure that it's not toxic, okay? Rather than before you put the product on the market, you're required to make sure it's not toxic. That is not the way the system works today.
Some products.
Some products do, like medications and things that people in some cases are going to consume. Again, like the food and drugs do take a much more precautionary approach. But lots of these other compounds and items that we utilize are not looked at in this type of fashion because we aren't directly ingesting them. We're not smearing them on our body.
I don't get it. There was one product that it was like a new battery or something.
Mhm.
The way that it worked was like a way that you harness kinetic energy
Yeah.
and it made power. And then there was another one that was like a light tool that removes tattoos or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And all of that had to be FDA approved before they were allowed to put it on the market. I don't understand why that would have to be approved, but then like they're not going to test what they're putting on your body.
That's what I mean is there's this double standard when it comes to some products versus others. And our history shows that we make mistakes when we don't look at stuff beforehand. Okay, so like let's start doing that. Let's make that the way that we produce products and the way that we put things out for us to utilize and for the environment beforehand. So we prevent the problems before we even get there.
You don't get sued for that? How have you do due diligence?
Yes, but in general, the companies, of course, are sued to such an extent that they go out of business. And so they don't clean up their mess because there's no money to do so, and they don't pay out benefits to survivors because they've gone back into bankruptcy. So it's a terrible cycle. And that only encourages companies to continue to produce potentially toxic products and not test them because they want to make their money before we find out that there's a problem.
If they get sued, they're going to lose it.
Yes, but they, as a producer, are likely not to be the ones that actually get sued, right? Like, if you are the manufacturer of a product today and you get it on the market, and in 50 years we find out that it causes people to grow 7 toes instead of 5 on each foot, which might be an advantage, you're going to be dead, okay? Like, yeah, like I hope to be alive in 50 years, but it's tenable, right? Like, I'm going to be at a point where I don't care if you sue me. I've made my money. I have put it offshore in places where you can't get to it, and my family will inherit it. And like, I don't care what happens to you because I have made my money. That's an extraordinarily selfish perspective. But that's what we see happen time and time again. And certainly it's not the workers at these companies that are trying to make money. It really, is management in some of these cases. I wish I could tell you that every manager is ethical, and there are lots of companies, but there are just as many non-ethical companies that are in it for profits, that are in it for shareholders. Okay, let's go back. Yep, we did that. Okay, cool. All right. So, solutions that are based on prevention instead of cleanup, there are several of these that are out there, where we see that international organizations, or in particular conglomerates of countries, are trying to take the precautionary principle approach to heart and are trying to prevent problems before they occur. Some examples of the precautionary principle already in action. In 2007, there was the REACH project in the European Union. This idea to start to look for safe chemical alternatives for certain unknown or potentially toxic products. The idea that companies look at their manufacturing processes, they look at the end of life cycle of products, and they identify what potential toxins might be, and then they look to develop it or other alternatives that won't have those same problems. That encourages companies to take a precautionary approach. If you give them a framework in which to work, then they're more likely to do that rather than being focused solely on profits. In 2011, there were EPA restrictions on the amount of mercury. That's the HG here is the chemical notation for mercury and particulates that were released in coal-burning power plant emissions. The idea that we're going to try to track and prevent these compounds from entering the atmosphere before they become further problematic. And the Minamata Convention, that is a body signed onto by a variety of nations in the United Nations, again, was looking at requiring those companies that produce particulates that contain mercury, what the best practices are so that we reduce mercury contamination in the environment around us. Mercury is one of these things that once it forms into an organic compound, it can be bioaccumulated and biomagnified by both humans and other organisms. And in the higher levels of the food chain, like in us, the high concentrations start to cause both physiological and developmental cognitive problems in people. The problem, I would say here, is that the enforcement of these regulations has to be taken into account. That signing on does not mean that a particular company or nation will adhere to the regulations or guidelines. The big problem with the Minamata Convention, of course, is that the United States has not signed on to it, and that many of these coal-fired power plant emission standards and the Environmental Protection Agency have been rolled back in the last 2 years. The idea that company profits, energy production is more important than human health, hopefully is something that does not sit well with you. And that the precautionary principle is all about putting humans most importantly first. When we protect humans, we end up usually protecting the environment around us too, which leads to healthier people. Changes in these precautionary principles mean that we might have new environmental disasters in the future. Okay, but it does cost, as I was saying, there is pushback to the precautionary principle. It is expensive to introduce new chemicals and products. If you are concerned about the toxicity or safety of your product, that means you have to develop a new one. That can be expensive, that can cost you money to do. It can be a regulatory overburden. Because of the precautionary principle, you have to prove something is safe first, which means, as I mentioned before, it's going to take you more money and it will take you longer to get something to market. That is something that companies don't like. They want to produce something and they want to get it out to consumers right away. So the idea of having to prove that it's safe first is something that seems abhorrent to them in some cases and really contradictory to their bottom line. This definitely can be problematic when we're talking about medications, but it's something that we recognize is absolutely necessary for human health. The idea that it takes time and more expense then could lead to fewer jobs that are able to be supported by companies because they're having to pay for regulations up front. It means that they have less money to go into salaries. So it could affect jobs as well. But when the precautionary principle has been tried, most companies find that it actually does not cost more, that they're actually able to save money by making sure that products are safe because they save on waste spills that they have to clean up, and they save on lawsuits that they have to deal with later. It is a shift in culture within different companies to move towards the precautionary principle. And it's almost like you have to try it in order to say, hey, it's actually not that bad. Okay, it's like composting at your house. Like you have to try it, and then you go, actually, it's not that bad. Okay. 3M, which is one of the large manufacturing companies, of course, here in the United States, they started their 3P program, which is pollution prevention, a few years ago, and they have since adopted over 10,000 different projects within the company where they have tried to tailor manufacturing processes so that they produce less pollution, whether it's air pollution or water pollution or solid waste. They are using less mineral resources. You know, one of the M's in 3M is mining. Okay. There's less waste and less land use in their resource extraction projects. And with these 10,000 different projects, I think they've prevented 1.8 million metric tons of pollution. And in doing so, they saved the company almost $2 billion, which is really important when it comes to jobs that they're trying to secure and when it comes to shareholder stock prices. We worry about the precautionary principle being a burden on companies, but companies that try it find that it actually works and saves them money. But we as consumers have to demand it. We have to say we want to be sure that these products are safe beforehand. I think I convinced you all. Someone is setting out to do that today. Think about this when you get into your career. What is it that you're doing? What is it that you're involved in where you can make a difference? Where you can put into place the precautionary principle. You can use common sense to save your company money. It doesn't have to cost money to save the environment. Okay. Do you have any questions? One of the things on your study guide was about the precautionary principle, and I was like, you know, I feel like I want to talk about it. Rather than go right on to it. Any questions about solid waste? I really encourage you to listen to the National Sword link that I have on Blackboard for you guys. That's the 99% Invisible that talks about these changing waste policies in China and how it affects the United States. That have an interesting take on what's happening here in the U.S., as well as they take a look at a couple different countries, really cities that have tried to adapt to the changing waste production and how to encourage recycling and appropriate solid waste disposal in their particular location. And what works and what doesn't, it gives you an idea of what might work for you, what might work in your community. Again, the idea is to recognize that there are people and companies that are trying these things. Let's take a look to see if it works. There are all these experiments that are running around us. Let's start to bring in the data and make wise decisions on a larger scale. Okay, let's talk about energy. Big kind of shift, but recognize that it's our last way in which we utilize land is that we utilize land in order to provide us with mineral resources that we then utilize to turn into energy. And this is really fossil fuels. And we'll talk about what is a fossil fuel, and we'll look at some of these different fossil fuel resources. Today, as well as after spring break, we want to look today largely at what are our sources and uses of energy. I think we all probably recognize what these things are, but let's make sure that we have a foundation before we start to talk about renewables and before we start to talk about the problems that accumulate when we utilize fossil fuels. Some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today are how we compare energy resources. Like if we really want to take what I consider like a non-biased look at these resources and make a really responsible decision, then let's do that based upon things like energy production and energy efficiency and sustainability, rather than I just don't like coal. Okay, let's try to make sure that our decisions are based upon facts and solid science. Okay? We're going to hopefully get to talk about petroleum and natural gas and coal and nuclear energy. Again, if not today, then as we get out of spring break. And we're in the last sections of chapter 14 and chapter 15 in our text. It's really a nice bridge, as I mentioned earlier in class, between land use, when we're taking these things out of the land around us, these resources, and air pollution, which is the major consequence of these types of energy resources. Okay, all right, so now let's talk. The first thing that I'm going to ask you to do today then is to write your name on the worksheet. And I want you to answer the first question on the worksheet. Everybody gets a worksheet, but you are definitely encouraged to talk to your neighbor. What are energy resources? How do we get energy? And is that particular energy resource renewable? Most of what we talk about when we really talk about hydroelectric is based on rivers, what we call run of stream. So rivers, and usually it's associated with a dam of some type. There are very few places that use precipitation for electricity, but you can do that too, like rainfall. What else, Elena?
Solar.
Good, solar. Wind. Good, so,
Kinetic energy.
yeah, I'm gonna say kind of, let's do like, so we had hamsters.
Is that kinetic?
Yeah,
Physical movement, that's kinetic.
yeah, it is kinetic energy, and it is the basis of wind as well as water energy is kinetic movement, and we're gonna, harness some flow of water or air particles in order to
That's the
turn.
term of turbine. Kinetic
Right.
energy harnesses like the movement of something.
Right, and again, like it depends upon what thing you want to look at as to, like what are we harnessing flowing water? Well, that's water, hydroelectric, and the wind, that's wind energy. Again, you can talk about the human body, you can talk about animal power, you can talk about, falling leaves if you wanted to. It just depends upon like how fine a gradation you want to take to it. Okay. I would say that in general, this type of kinetic energy, when we think about it as different from these other two, we're thinking about some type of living organism generating that motion or movement to it, rather than something over the kind of physical environment.
Well, because that's the thing with the wind energy, is there's nothing turning the turbine. The difference is for solar, or for wind and for water, it turns the turbine. and
Right,
uses-
directly.
But kinetic energy, what it's doing is it has some sort of technology that literally doesn't do anything but harness the movement of whatever it is.
Right, and then you can turn it directly into electricity,
Yeah.
which is kind of what happens in solar. Or you can turn it directly into turning the turbine. Good. We'll talk about like how does a power plant work. That's what we're doing. What else? Nuclear. Good. How do we say this word? Do we even know anymore as a civilization?
Yeah.
Huh?
Nuclear?
That's how I say that. Nuclear. Nuclear.
Okay. What else? Coal.
I mean, I guess that's fossil fuels.
Coal's a fossil fuel. What else qualifies as a fossil fuel?
Natural gas.
Good. Natural gas.
I just said fossil fuels.
What else? Petroleum oil. Anything else?
There's energy on like a cellular level, like in our bodies, I guess.
I guess we can think of like all of these are going to be they're all solar driven in one derivative or another. Nuclear is probably the most basic chemical that we get, although in the burning of any of these, we're talking about chemical transformations that produce the energy that we're going to harness.
Nuclear is chemical.
Yeah. Okay, which of these are renewables?
Aqua.
Yeah.
Solar.
But it's
Any more, Bob?
It is better in lots of aspects compared to our traditional fossil fuels, which we think of as our traditional non-renewables. But the real problem with nuclear energy, although it's one of the most efficient and definitely gives us the highest amount of energy per starting unit of material, is that we have a finite, limited resource on Earth of it. That's not going to be replenished in our lifetimes, which is going to be part of our renewable definition.
But it takes so little.
It takes a little, right, that is really helpful. Like, nuclear is our transition from this to this.
They need one atom and they split it. and
Yeah,
makes
it's-
enough energy with it.
It's crazy, right? Like, there's a reason this is powerful, both as an energy resource and in the military and medicine. But we're not making more of it on a human timescale than what we have on Earth today. And the waste production is probably the worst.
Oh, yeah. Well,
And so that's not sustainable. Best probably in terms of efficiency, best in terms of energy production, worst in terms almost of sustainability. And so that's why it gets categorized within non-renewables for us. But recognize that it is bad, better, best.
solar and wind are probably the best too.
They are, and we'll see that they are better in a variety of ways that we can do this type of evaluation of what's going on with our energy resources. They're good for a variety. Okay, so we have all these different ways that we can produce energy. We'll talk a little bit about how we harness energy. We started talking about that from these different resources. What do we actually utilize? On a worldwide basis, in terms of energy that's produced, 90% of worldwide energy is produced from those non-renewable resources, nuclear, natural gas, coal, or oil, petroleum products. Here in the United States, it's the same. 90% of our energy, whatever it's used for, is coming from non-renewable resources. Renewable energy, whether it's hydroelectric or solar or geothermal, we didn't talk about that. Biomass, you can burn stuff that doesn't short circuit the carbon cycle. That is usually a much smaller fraction of energy production, usually somewhere between 7 and 10%. And hydroelectric is kind of winning the renewable race right now. It's generating more energy than other renewable resources. Yeah, Caleb.
That's very out of date.
It is 2014. So this is the figure from our textbook. And so the textbook, I think, was printed last year, and it was compiled, from 2014 data. Unfortunately, these numbers have not changed a lot. Okay, it might be that it's 11 or 12% today that's renewable energy, but it's not like we're making a big shift to 20% renewables and 80% non-renewables. Oh look, I don't know if I have a more up-to-date figure. Caleb will look now. Okay, but a ton of what we do is non-renewable energy. Renewables, even though we know they're out there, we can identify them readily, they're not a big fraction of energy production. Okay, so what makes something renewable or not? Okay, these are again definitions that our textbook uses and that I'm going to utilize for this class, and that I want you to kind of start thinking about. So a renewable energy resource is first and foremost one that is replenished on a human timescale. That more of it will be produced within the lifetime of a human. Okay? This means that, again, the resource is not sometimes consumed. So, of course, in the wind and water energy production, the wind and the water is there after it interacts with the turbine. Okay, we're not consuming that particular resource. When we think about solar energy, yes, we're absorbing solar photons from the sun, but there's a plethora of solar energy that hits the surface of the earth and is not utilized either in solar energy generation or even by plants. They have really bad efficiency actually when it comes to picking up photons. We're not going to run out of that resource anytime soon, okay? And that's this renewable cycle, okay? We're not consuming the resource faster than it can be reproduced. Okay, that is a real problem when it comes to fossil fuels. All of our fossil fuels take millennia to produce. We are using them at a rate that is much faster than the current rate at which our Earth is producing organic matter and storing it to later be turned into fossil fuels for the future. Our other big factor when it comes to whether or not an energy resource is renewable or not is whether or not it short circuits the global carbon cycle. When we think about the carbon cycle, recognize that there are processes like photosynthesis and respiration that happen on a daily basis, that have seasonal cycles, that are balanced in terms of carbon uptake and photosynthesis and carbon release when it comes to decomposition and respiration. We short circuit that cycle when we take carbon that's buried deep in the earth as a fossil fuel and we suddenly release it into the atmosphere without a similar removal mechanism for the same rate and magnitude at which we release that carbon. Okay. A non-renewable resource short circuits that carbon cycle. It adds more carbon, or takes it out perhaps. Then it can be replenished or removed from the short-term global carbon cycle. Okay. Things like nuclear energy, solar, wind, hydrothermal, biomass production, and use in burning, those things don't short-circuit the global carbon cycle. Okay, they're not changing the amount of carbon that's already on the surface of the Earth. Okay. When we take fossil fuels, we inject a ton of carbon into the global carbon cycle at the surface, and that changes the dynamics of flow of carbon with some really significant consequences. Okay, that makes them non-renewable. That makes them unsustainable. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, not only are they replenished, that we're going to have enough of them around, but they also have to not screw up the carbon cycle. All right, are the two factors. When we look at our reserves and availability of these different resources, it's important to keep in mind where we have reserves of fossil fuel energy resources, where we have reserves of nuclear energy resources, what locations are good for hydroelectric and solar and wind. Not every place has the same complement of resources for energy production. We know that we have proven reserves of things like petroleum, which is what this particular diagram is showing you, that there's tons of petroleum and oil in the ground in places like Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and Canada. Those places are places where there's a lot of production of it, but recognize that the places that are utilizing oil are not the places that have big proven reserves of it or that are producing lots of petroleum. And so the renewable status and the availability of energy resources is a play of market supply and demand, just like it is with other mineral resources. And that the distribution of fossil fuels is not even across the surface of the earth, and some places and locations are richer in each of these resources than others, and that where these resources are consumed often is in dissonance with the places where these resources actually happen and occur. And that creates conflict. It also makes these resources valuable. Did you find out how much energy production is renewable? What is it? 17. Okay. So today, 17%. And 83% not. All right, we're getting better.
It's pretty good for you.
That's pretty. That's not bad, yeah. I wish I could say a lot of that transfer is happening in the United States, but it's not. A bunch of it is in Europe, as well as China is slowly shifting. Yeah, Elena.
Do you think electric cars is a good help to reducing the amount of energy that we use?
Yes, definitely when it comes to transportation. In that electricity as a fuel source is more efficient than directly burning fossil fuels in your car. The best option for electric cars is to make sure that they're fueled off the electric grid that is using a renewable electricity resource. And so that, here in Ohio, you have choices about, you can tell your power company where to buy the electricity from that you want to utilize. And so if you have an electric vehicle in Ohio, you should make sure that your home is being powered by solar or wind or hydroelectric energy, so that it's not fossil fuels that continue to power your vehicle, even though you're using electricity rather than a fossil fuel directly. It is definitely a step in the right direction. Yeah, solar power cars. Hydrogen fusion. All right. Okay, there are lots of renewable energy resources. You know, Adrian brought up paper wheels. There's a ton of stuff that we can utilize that would count as a renewable resource. Man-made tornadoes, big kites, lightning. We talked about garbage incineration being an energy production resource. Biofuels are really big and interesting today, whether it's algal biofuels that are producing petroleum products directly for us, whether we're taking sugar cane or cordgrass and we're fermenting it into diesel that can go into diesels. All of those things are renewable. Even though we're still burning them, we're dealing with the carbon that's here on the surface of the earth with us. When we burn and use them, when we produce them, we don't change the amount of carbon that's on the surface. And that doesn't mess with the carbon cycle, okay? It doesn't make it any better, but it doesn't make it any worse, okay? So there's all kinds of things that are interesting here to think about as a potential energy resource. All right, the purpose of this infographic was just to kind of get you to think a little bit outside of the box. Okay, so now look at the second question on your worksheet. What do we use this energy for? Okay, when we produce energy from burning coal, what does it go into? How do we utilize it? Why do we need this stuff? Why do we need it? Second question. You can talk to your neighbor. Okay, what do we use this energy for? Yeah, Elena.
Manufacturing goods.
Good. Cassidy.
Electricity.
What else?
Agriculture.
Okay. Recognize that it's cars, it's planes, it's boats, right? It's trains. What else? Yeah, where do you use energy in your house?
Laundry, lights,
Like gas, water, heater.
electricity. Like, I know,
Yeah.
don't most people have electricity that
Yeah.
does their heat?
Yeah.
It's like, it's really, electricity covers like,
It does. Electricity fuels a lot of stuff, okay? Recognize where your electricity comes from. That becomes really important. Okay? In terms of transportation, that's another huge energy resource, okay? And again, manufacturing is based upon electricity. Manufacturing is based upon transportation, getting goods to the plant, getting things transported to consumers. Agriculture is the same way. We're going to put energy in order to till the ground and plant the seeds and harvest the stuff, and then we're going to use energy to get it to consumers, to process it, to transport it. Yeah, Caleb.
is electricity better than, the term of what we use exactly, but like, you have gas stove, gas heater. Is electricity better than that, or is it
It depends upon what is fueling your electricity. And so if natural gas is fueling your electricity at your electricity power generation plant, then it's the same efficiency. If nuclear is doing it, then your electricity is much more efficient. It would behoove you to get an electric stove because the electricity production is much more efficient. If you want to have direct transfer of heat to your source, then natural gas, burning it directly on site, or having a wood-fired stove or heater is more efficient because whatever heat is generated goes directly into your home rather than having to be transferred into electricity and then sent to your house where we're going to use it to turn to heat air to blow around your house. Each time we make an energy transfer, we lose some of the energy to get less efficient. So the fewer energy transfers, the more efficient.
I've always preferred natural gas. I like the way it heats the house better. I like the way it.
Right, yeah. I like it better for cooking because you can control it more than with the stove. Like on the stove, you have options these days with your electric stove. But with the gas heat, you can really control it, how much you're using and cooking better. But
That's exactly right. I just didn't know if it was like if I'm making a horrible environmental decision.
no, it's not that bad. Okay, it would be better if there were other options. But it's not a natural gas for gas-fired ovens and stoves in people's homes.
Is there another use like thing? What would people use if they didn't use natural gas?
They would use wood. If you want to cook that same way, if you want to go away from electricity, then you would use a wood-fired stove. And recognize that most people on the planet, that is still how they cook their food, is with either coal or wood-burning devices for cooking food. And again, we want to move them away from coal because that short circuits the global carbon cycle. We want them to be using biomass. But when they use wood, then we have deforestation problems.
So you just burn the trash.
Potentially, if your trash is safe to do so with, right? And that again goes into what are we putting in our waste stream? That could be harmful if we were to burn it to cook our food. Morgan.
Medical equipment also go on that list.
Good. And like what though is that medical equipment? Electricity. Okay, so what are we using stuff for? We're using it first and foremost for transportation. About 28% of our energy production goes into transportation of one type or another, whether it's electricity, whether it's fossil fuels. Another huge chunk, 39% of our energy use is for electricity, okay? Industrial, residential uses of a variety of heating, manufacturing processes take up larger chunks of this. Notice that depending upon the resource for energy production, it kind of goes into different sectors of use, okay? By and large, most of our petroleum oil production goes into transportation use. We do less burning of petroleum products to make electricity than we do other things. But things like coal, most of the coal that we utilize goes into electricity power production, okay? And when we're thinking about alternatives to energy use and energy resources, you have to think about both things. What is the energy resource, and then what are we trying to replace its use for in society? And that means there might be different solutions depending upon what we're trying to avoid in the mining kind of resource use and what we are trying to provide for to replace society. But we know this, we recognize this, we understand what our energy resources are, we know what they're utilized for. Okay? Note that most of our renewable energy resources are going into electricity production. We aren't using them for transportation. So we have a big kind of hole when it comes to replacing fossil fuels and non-renewables when it comes to transportation. Okay, so answer the last question on your worksheet, although we've talked about it to some degree. Why do you think that we need renewable energy resources? We've already listed the renewable energy ones, so I feel like we have to do that again. But why do we need renewable energy resources? Why is this shift important? why do we need renewables? Why are they so attractive to environmental science? Elena?
Because we're using energy at a rate we're using it faster than it's being replenished.
Good. When it comes to those fossil fuels, we're utilizing the resource faster than it can be replenished. We have vast reserves of coal and natural gas and oil on the planet. We are not in danger of running out of those supplies, but we are definitely not producing them today in terms of organic matter deposition at the same rate that we're using them. Dominic?
It's a lot safer to harvest and use.
Good, it is. It's much safer for workers. It's much less land use detrimental to utilize renewables than non-renewables. When we utilize fossil fuels, we have all those difficulties and consequences of mining that we talked about. Yeah.
So, I have two things. First, one of the things is that it has a better efficiency. Going on that, I was kind of wondering and thinking, why is it that these huge coal burning companies haven't started, like, I get that it's expensive to buy the equipment and the solar panels, but if they slowly use their profits to build a solar panel farm,
Yeah, or wind farm,
or whatever it is.
or whatever.
They don't have to spend any more money. So like now
Or they don't have to go out of business.
Yeah,
You
they
don't have to
sell them.
lose jobs.
They've got the solar panels. And the great thing about a solar panel is solar panels up, you're done.
I know, right? And it does take maintenance. It's not like you're gonna lose jobs. Like those big wind turbines, like they get broken and they need to have upkeep. I mean, it's just like your car. You gotta go into them, change the oil. Like there are jobs in those fields. I don't know, okay? I don't understand why the energy companies in some cases are not transitioning themselves. But they're not looking at their profits and saying, yes, we're going to pay out this amount to shareholders. Yes, we're doing this amount in, salary increases that manage the cost of living. And then we're going to start transitioning our business away from coal.
Yeah, it's not like we're not making a ton.
Right. I'm from the outside, because I'm not an insider to these types of businesses. Again, it makes a lot of sense to start that transition. The only thing I would think of is that it is expensive, and they may not have the in-house expertise to start that process.
The crazy thing is when it takes like the small solar panels. If you have like 2 small solar panels,
Yeah.
you can create your own electricity for your house.
Yeah, it doesn't take a lot, and if you combine it with some natural gas or a small wind turbine at your home, you don't have to worry about cloudy days or winter time when it comes to solar reliability.
Well, because they have, the way they do it now is they have someplace that it stores its energy.
Right, a battery.
Yeah, and so then that, as long as you don't live in a place where it's cloudy for like a month.
Like Seattle.
Yeah.
More.
I think just the companies not wanting to do it is more based around there isn't a massive public outcry and they still have plenty of resources to go.
True.
So why do it's not going
Right.
to.
It is cheaper to utilize coal, for which you have a system set up to both produce energy, sell the energy, mine the resource to continue to produce the energy, than to start the process of shifting. We have to demand that these companies do that. We have to show that we want renewable energy in our transportation and in our electricity generation processes, that we want it to start this revolution.
I think it also comes to just not being educated about the issues that we're having.
Good, and that's another real thing. If you don't recognize these problems that we associate with fossil fuels as problems, then there's no incentive for you as a corporation or as an individual to push for change. And there's a spectrum, remember, in the way that people place values and beliefs. And it's not usually until things start to become problematic for you as a person that you're willing to make these shifts and changes. Yeah.
The only struggle I'm having is they should have an incentive. Like, I'm a business major, so for me, it's all about, when you're in business, it's all about ROI. What's your return on investment?
Right, like we're going to talk about EROI, energy return on investment.
But the thing is if they did the solar panels, you have that one-time cost, and yes, that's going to be expensive. In 5 years, they'll pay themselves off, and then you're making more money than you were if you were in it.
Exactly. It's the same thing with a geothermal heat pump for your home. You it may be expensive to install one in your home, but within 10 years, you will pay it off. Okay, and like, think about the lifetime of your home. Okay, like you're gonna be in it for a while, or you're gonna be able to sell it at a premium because it has a geothermal heat pump in it. It's all about perspective, it's all about value. And I want you to start to recognize that your values might be very in line with what we're talking about in class, and some of these other values may seem be heretical to you almost. You know, you're like, oh my gosh, why would someone think to do this way? That doesn't make them a bad person. That does not make them a bad company. It means that they need to transition. They need more information. Somehow we have to help them get that information and use it in a wise, responsible fashion. Okay, we're at time for class. I'm not going to embark on what are the pros and cons of natural gas and petroleum and coal, which are definitely on your study guide. That's where we're going after spring break. Please study for Thursday's exam. All right. If you have questions about the study guide, we're not doing the last few questions that are on the study guide or the last 3 or 4 terms that are on there. Please don't hesitate to email me. I will try to be here in this classroom a little bit before class if you have content questions. Do not forget to sign up for Service Learning 2 if you are interested in coming with us, although we'll have the materials here on Thursday. Please give me your energy worksheet from today so I can give you participation credit. And I will see you on Thursday. A minute ago, have a good day. I'll take that to you.